Hi, everyone. This is Angela Stockman, and I want to talk a little bit about what it might look like to build better writers right now when there's so much tension and confusion in the field and evolving understanding about what it could look like to serve children, teenagers, and even grown adults a bit better here. If you've worked with me for any amount of time, then you might recognize some of the pictures on this screen. I've been teaching writing for over 30 years, and for the last almost 2 decades, I've been responsible for facilitating curriculum design, shifting instructional practice, redesigning assessments, and leading the transition to standards based and competency based grading and reporting in K-16 classrooms. I'm also the founder of the Western New York Young Writers Studio, which is a learning community comprised of teachers and children in Western New York. I have the opportunity to bring pop up studios to different school districts throughout the United States, Canada, and other places as well, and as needed. It's been incredibly rewarding work. If you know me at all, then you know that I have been committed to pedagogical documentation and action research throughout the duration of this time. And I've published several books that reflect my findings. I want to talk about how my understandings about teaching writing well have evolved over the years. I left the classroom in 2004, a teacher who was very much committed to writing workshop. I was so committed to it that I felt I was not doing justice to the students that I served. I had between 130 and 140 students every year. I worked on a team that really served inclusion students well, and I was really stymied by the fact that I was spending nearly every weekend drowning in the review of my students' work, unable to provide high quality feedback to them in a timely manner simply because of the volume of what I was trying to cut through, and really looking for answers. I left that position to become a regional staff developer for Erie One BOCES. And in that role, I spent 4 years meeting teachers who were struggling with exactly the same issue. Some of them remain my closest friends and colleagues locally today. In 2008, I left that role to found the Western New York Young Writers Studio and begin inviting people in my community, teachers, to position themselves as students and to actually make young writers our greatest teachers. It was then that I began to learn more about pedagogical documentation, and that awareness deepened as I went with my friend Lorella on several study tours to Reggio Emilia, Italy. I've perfected and continue to grow my understanding of what it means to teach writing well in the company of many young writers and many young teachers who remain committed to documentation, reflection, seeking diverse perspectives, and rooting ourselves not only in quantitative research, but qualitative evidence as well. And the work of other incredible scholars in the field. The ideas that I'm going to share with you are informed by all of these efforts, and the science is not settled, and my learning isn't done. I want to make sure that I'm clear about that as I share these new ideas and concepts with all of you, especially those of you who have been with me for a while. It's important that we remain learners. It's important that we keep reading, listening, talking to one another, and trying to protect the best of what workshop culture helped us become as writing teachers and writing communities, even as we learn more about what it looks like to do that equitably and in ways that improve outcomes for learners. At the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. Our opinions don't necessarily matter. It's not what we feel or what we believe. It's what we're learning, what research has to show us, and most importantly, when we operationalize that in classrooms, it's about what improves learning outcomes for kids. Let's dive in. One of the most uncomfortable shifts that I began advocating for in my curriculum design work inside of schools round about 2010, 2011 was putting a critical eye on the center of the curriculum that we were teaching and designing into and aligning around. So often we were using programs, approaches, curriculum, and lessons and instructional practices that really centered the writing process as we defined it. Students were given opportunities to engage in some quick brainstorming, typically. They were encouraged to draft long and produce a lot of volume. And then we would put feedback on those drafts, and students sometimes would commit to the revision process, but more often than not, that became a very heavy lift. And so did editing. While we were all encouraged to make that process recursive, bell schedules and so many of the other structures that are inherent in school often made that impossible. And also, students were supposed to be writing for real audiences, but oftentimes they weren't, and time for that was really short. It became hard. Over time, and it was through the work of pedagogical documentation and being responsive to the learners that I served, two things became really apparent in my data. The first was that structure really mattered. Students needed to not just have graphic organizers, they needed to be able to conceptualize a structure and to represent the ideas that they had for it. This was my second discovery with materials. While drawing was really popular and it remains very common today, I found that two things complicated drawing. The first was that students lacked confidence in their ability to draw well, and they were very much concerned with the aesthetic of it all. There was a lot of erasure and a lot of frustration and self-consciousness there. And that took up a lot of time. Loose parts became a way for students to represent their ideas across a form very early on in a unit or a writing experience so that we could make a rapid assessment of whether or not their idea was viable, coherent, and rich enough for them to maintain a commitment to. Materials allowed them to represent very complex ideas in ways that allowed them to talk about them well. And this made for a great formative assessment early on, and it helped us gain traction as we move forward. I began sharing these illustrations in my books and in my work with teachers, really reinforcing the fact that these were not graphic organizers, but instead they were visual representations of what it looked like for learners to write in ways that helped them take a stand at the top of this document, maybe at the primary level, in the middle, at the middle school level, and what it looked like as writers gained confidence and experience and maybe grew into who they were as high schoolers. I created documents like this for different kinds of writing that were very common and also aligned to our Common Core learning standards. And as soon as this work started making its way into schools, many people started reaching out to me to share stories about how it was making a difference for writers, particularly those who initially presented, and I use that word with intention, presented as reluctant or resistant. So much more research had to happen in order for me to understand why structure and materials really mattered. And I wrote about that in my next books following my first. Make Writing was all about some simple shifts that we could make in order to create workshops that felt more like makerspaces. And that was my angle and my theme and my hope then, because my early research showed that many of the students who were defining or presenting as resistant really weren't resistant writers. They were simply makers. And if we could make the workshop experience feel more like a makerspace and function more like a makerspace, if writing could be more like building over and over and over again, we were improving outcomes for learners. But I didn't understand why. And that's because I used my very sort of newbie approach to grounded theory methodology. I was new to that then. And I was grounding my theories in the lived learning experiences of the learners that I served. And I was documenting my learning and inviting other teachers and students to do so along the way. I wasn't seeking the literature of the field in that moment, but I certainly tried to go back to it. And at that time, there wasn't much that I could find around what I was noticing about the use of materials until I encountered the field of multimodal composition and all of the great thinkers and scholars inside of that particular corner of my edusphere really began to compel an interest and inspire and help me understand why these things were happening inside of schools. Every time I've completed an action research or pedagogical documentation cycle, I've published a book and shared the findings, and I've continued to say, this is all highly experimental. I've gained tremendous confidence, though, over the years about why structure and materials matter. And it's completely shifted how I organize units and how I invite students to make and write bit by bit. If you look at this particular illustration, you're going to see that rather than using the writing process as we know it to structure a unit or a writing experience, rather than making the process the spine of a unit, I now use structure instead. Here you see one example, not the example, one example of a structure that we might use for personal narrative writing. Character and setting, a moment that mattered, why it mattered, and what readers might take away or learn or be inspired by. I found that if students are able to build just one bit of that form, for instance, their character and setting, if I drop some very targeted feedback that's aligned to my mini lesson intention or target over their shoulder, and they better the build, and then they start talking about it, almost every time their ideas that they share aloud are far more complex than those they would have the print power to pull off. But if we keep the move small, if we shrink the amount of writing that we're demanding from them in a single session, and we share sentence frames or mentor passages with them, especially if we differentiate and scaffold them, students are able to speak what they would intend to write. And if they can audio record it or have a friend echo it back to them, or even use those PVC, silly little PVC pipes to have them whisper write by saying that small bit over and over again, they can begin to transcribe it. And then we can coach syntax and conventions and usage in a way that not only helps them revise that bit and make it more complex, but edit it as well. And then we simply repeat the process bit by bit as we move through that structure. What emerges is often an incredibly solid draft, and we've protected students' stamina. We have been intentional about working with their verbal working memory in ways that does not overwhelm them. We've given them the opportunity to consistently learn about phonics, syntax, to be able to work with craft in a really micro way, and conventions as well. Syntax and conventions are taught far more often now than they typically were in my former life. And in addition to that, I've freed up space for me to really study what students are able to do as makers and what they're able to produce as writers. This has led to far more meaningful assessment conversations. It's made us far more diagnostic and astute in our interpretations and the next steps that we take in service to young writers. None of this has changed workshop culture. Students are still able to produce real things for real audiences, and they have tremendous choice around what that could look like, as always. But I've learned this as well. When we situate this approach inside of a knowledge building curriculum and we take an interdisciplinary approach, it has this profound impact on the complexity of the work that students produce, as well as the pride that they take in it and their confidence levels. What's really exciting, for instance, is that I've worked with schools to intentionally move narrative writing to the end of the school year. And throughout the year, students might, for example, study historical figures and really begin to understand how their characters were brought to life, what characteristics are. They begin to have a much deeper appreciation for people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Joan of Arc or Anne Frank. If we bring the power of literary analysis into the disciplines in this way, and then we invite learners to transfer it back into their narrative writing, they begin to create characters that are really reflective of and who possess the same characteristics that those historical figures did. And that impacts the plot. It impacts the conflict. It impacts the way they design those stories. Those stories become reflective of the knowledge that they've built. When people look at how I hang units together, and oftentimes when I initially begin my work with teachers inside of schools, they worry that learners will become bored because we're not writing quick. This is the sort of writing experience you situate inside of workshop. It's the sort of writing experience where students are writing real things for real audiences that are actually excited to consume them. Students are also working to build independence one micro move at a time. But I will tell you that this does take time, and it's different than writing to demonstrate comprehension of the things that we're studying inside of the reading portion of the day, or social studies, or science, or mathematics, or art, or music. We write in order to demonstrate comprehension. That's very different than writing for an authentic audience, and students must learn how to do this as well. This is where they find their voice, where they have to make different and more complex decisions and become independent in their ability to determine what it is they have to say, who it is they want to say it to, how they're going to be of influence in the world, how they're going to shape their communities, how they're going to become good citizens. This is where that happens. And all of those skills that they build inside of those other more academic writing experiences, they serve them well here as well. People often wonder, will they get bored? And it's a question that I've taken very seriously and that I've studied. And what you'll see here is that there are usually 3 craft lessons that are aligned to any bit of the form. And they might unfold on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday during a week. Students make or build, they speak aloud, they listen to what it is they would intend to write, and then they produce just a bit of writing each day. The materials get put away. This isn't about pretty. This isn't about the aesthetic. It's about representation. It's about artifacts that contain the complexity of our ideas so that we don't overwhelm that working memory. In lesson 4, they compose sentences. They learn how to do that in simple and far more complex ways and for really interesting purposes. And in lesson 5, they typically work with conventions or usage. We tighten up and revise and edit just that small bit before we move on to the next. And my evidence shows they don't typically get bored because these lessons are very short. They're just about 30 minutes long. There's ample opportunity to build and talk and move and write just a little bit and respond to just a targeted microdose of feedback. It is incredibly engaging. It is incredibly embodied, and it is incredibly multimodal. And it is all about moving them toward designing real things for real people. This is a template that you're welcome to replicate and tinker with and play with. Here's an example for argument writing. And I'm leaving you with this particular structure. Do you have to have 5 lessons a week? No. And in fact, in week 4 of this example, you're going to see that I've lightened it up because we left some room for heavier and longer one-on-one conferencing there. Something else that I want to speak to, which is not the topic of today's conversation, is the importance of alignment. Mini lessons are aligned to our standards. They're also aligned to important and critical knowledge that we want students to gain. They're also aligned to specific craft moves and lessons in phonics and syntax and conventions that need to scaffold over time. Would it be wonderful for you as an individual teacher to frame your year in this way and to get really intentional about creating those learning progressions for phonics and craft and syntax and conventions? It would. But what's more important is that you're creating alignment across your system, K-12, and that you're articulating that curriculum in a way that is light enough and agile enough to be responsive to the writers that you are serving not only this year, but over time. I find that templates like this are useful. This is work that I've done in a sustained way in school districts for well over a decade now. And in many of those places, I've been able to stay long term. We're able to trace and notice the impact of this shift on learning outcomes for students. And we take care to triangulate our data. Sure, we look at standardized assessment scores. We also make sure we're studying trends over time and putting our eye on important patterns. But in addition to that, we triangulate that task data to include local measures and summative assessments and capstone projects and the products that students produce. We also add to that perspective around talk. We audio record and we use really astute tools to be able to notice patterns and trends in those audio recordings as well. And we triangulate that with tendencies, behavioral data, tasks, talk, tendencies. What are those findings teaching us? What are those patterns suggesting? How are we documenting for that learning? What does it look like over time? That's a lot of my work in schools. And if it's something that you're interested in exploring more, I hope that you'll reach out to me. I'd love to talk with you. I'm also eager to share the Make Writing Starter Set, which you can access through this link in the slide deck that I will give you. I'm refreshing that document, and there will be an updated version in November. It's a couple of years old. So much of it still remains relevant and meaningful, but I want to take care to share the new things that I'm discovering as well. And I want to link you out to some great resources and researchers too. Speaking of which, these are the sources that informed some of the thinking that I'm sharing with you today. I encourage you to take a peek at some of these stories and sink into some of this research and reach out to me if you'd like to talk more. Thanks for being here, everybody. I hope that you'll stay in touch. You can click the link in that last sentence in order to stay connected to me online.